Most wild animals resist the fence, but not him. He leaned into it, like it was the only place left that could hold him together. When Taro first arrived at Cedar Valley Shelter, it was raining. Not a hard, punishing kind of rain, but the soft kind that settles into the moss and smells like old pine and stone. It was early spring. The river that cut past the shelter's back edge was high with meltwater, and the sky had just enough light left to see the edges of things. The driver who brought him didn't say much, just a clipboard, a few scribbled notes, a phrase underlined twice in red, "Too affectionate." That's not the kind of label you expect to see on a bobcat. Not when most of the reports at this kind of shelter are things like aggressive, cage-destructive, or unpredictable around staff. But Taro, he didn't growl. He didn't pace or bare his teeth. When they opened the back of the van, he was sitting quietly pressed against the corner of the crate, his body still eyes wide, ears turned forward not with fear, but with attention, like he was waiting for someone he still believed might come. They moved slowly. No tranquilizer, no gloves, just steady voices, soft steps. When the gate of the crate opened, he didn't bolt. He stepped out cautiously, one paw at a time, his fur patchy from stress grooming a faint tremble in his hind leg. But he walked. Inside the intake room, the staff gave him space. They weren't sure what to expect. Bobcats, even rescues, usually need time to decompress. But Taro didn't snarl. He didn't posture. Instead, he moved toward the nearest corner and rested his head gently against the wall, like a tired child leaning into someone's shoulder. That's when Rachel first saw him. Rachel had worked at the shelter for 6 years after 35 as a nurse in a small town an hour away. She didn't speak much about why she came out here after retirement, just that something about these animals felt familiar, honest. Still a little wild, but not in a way that tried to impress anyone. She had seen her share of creatures come through the gates. Hawks with shattered wings, foxes who'd lost their dens to bulldozers, raccoons so dehydrated they could barely stand. Most arrived afraid. Some arrived angry. All of them arrived alone. But she hadn't seen one arrive like Taro. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for a way in. Over the next few hours, the staff reviewed his file. There was nothing alarming. In fact, that's what stood out. No signs of aggression, no history of biting or swiping, no enclosure damage, no failed introductions to other animals. Just one repeated note clings to humans, tries to follow, distressed when left alone. The note suggested Taro had been raised by a private owner somewhere in the southwest, possibly as a kitten rescued from a roadside wildlife dealer. An attempt to raise him like a dog, the papers said. That attempt didn't last long. He bounced through a couple rehab centers before ending up at a wildlife sanctuary. He lived there for nearly 4 years, until that facility shut down. And the one after that, the last one before Cedar Valley, was more about display than care. At some point, it seems his longing for closeness became inconvenient. Rachel watched from the hallway as Taro was moved into a temporary indoor run. It was clean quiet, covered with a thick wool blanket and a large viewing pane. He sniffed once, then turned in a slow circle and pressed his body against the glass, as if asking, not demanding, "Will you stay?" She waited, let him settle. Then sometime near dusk, she stepped in with a bowl of venison and a folded towel. He looked up, didn't flinch. She crouched down beside him, knees popping, breath slow. Left the food a foot away, then rested the towel near his head. He looked at it, then at her, and without a sound, gently, so gently, he pressed his head against her knee and stayed. No claws, no sudden movements, just stillness, just trust. It's easy to talk about animal rescue like it's only about survival, patching wounds, feeding bodies, rebuilding strength. But what do we do when a creature doesn't just need saving, but connection? Taro didn't just want food or shelter. He wanted presence, and in that moment, so did Rachel. In the days that followed, a rhythm began. Morning cleanings, evening feedings. Rachel would sweep, hum, softly change his water, fluff the blanket. Taro would follow from inside his enclosure, not in a stalking way, but in a shadowing way. Quiet, close, never threatening, just there. Some staff found it odd, others found it disarming. But Rachel, she just let it be. "He doesn't need me to do anything spectacular," she told Ben one afternoon, "just to be consistent." And that was the first time Ben noticed her smiling in weeks. A few days and Rachel sat by the pane while Taro lay beside it, chest rising and falling. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar trees, scattering light across the grass. Inside, they just sat. No rush, no performance. Sometimes love sounds like silence. It's worth saying here because many still don't know bobcats are not domestic animals. They're wild cats native to much of North America, built for solitary lives and quiet hunts. They're elusive, reclusive, fierce when cornered, and beautiful. But they're not pets. They shouldn't be. And yet, some bobcats, under rare and complex circumstances, can form bonds. Deep, strange, moving bonds. Taro wasn't tame. He was tender, and that made all the difference. Not everyone understood it. That was okay. Love rarely follows a script. Sometimes it just presses softly against a fence and waits to be seen. Have you ever met someone or something that didn't need to be tamed, only trusted? There was something else in Taro's file that caught Ben's eye a few days later. A photo folded and tucked into the back. In it, Taro wasn't alone. Next, we learn what it really means to be too much. Most creatures are rejected for being dangerous. Taro was rejected for something quieter. He loved too much. It had been about a week since Taro arrived at Cedar Valley Shelter. Long enough for the rhythm of his days to settle into something familiar. Mornings came with quiet footsteps and soft whistles from the staff. Evenings with the wind whispering through the cedar grove and the rustle of leaves against chain link. But it wasn't the schedule that stayed with people. It was the way Taro watched. Not with the wary stare of most wild animals, but with an open, aching softness, as if he was always listening for something or someone. It was that gaze that made Ben stop by his enclosure more often. The kind of look that feels like it's asking you a question you can't quite answer. One afternoon, while sorting intake documents in the break room, Ben came across something unusual in Taro's file. A folded page worn at the corners like someone had touched it too many times. Inside was a printout of a behavioral log from the facility Taro had come from before this. Most of the boxes were blank. No biting, no pacing, no medical concerns. But under behavioral notes, several short entries had been made. Follows caregivers along fence line. Attempts to mimic purring. Distressed when volunteers leave. Leans against gates. Rubs face on boots, blankets. Over affectionate. Clingy. Inappropriate for educational display. That last sentence had been circled. Twice, there was no aggression, no threat, just one word that kept repeating too much. Ben sat with that phrase longer than he expected. It made him think of other things, people mostly. Students he used to teach, bright, sensitive kids who weren't difficult, just different. His partner too, who used to say the world breaks soft things first. That phrase returned to him now, staring at the page. Too much. For what exactly Rachel was sweeping near the front enclosures when Ben brought it up. "Did you see his log?" he asked. She nodded, kept sweeping. "I did." "What do you make of it?" She leaned on the handle, thoughtful. "It means he offered something most of us don't know how to accept. In a world that so often confuses vulnerability with weakness, affection can feel suspicious, like it must come with a catch. And in the world of wild animal rescue, that suspicion doubles. An animal that seeks touch, that initiates closeness, it unsettles people, because it doesn't fit the script. Bobcats are supposed to hiss or hide or crouch with twitching tails behind shrubs. They're supposed to be elusive to remind us of the line between us and them. But Taro blurred it. And that frightened people more than claws ever could. In one of the reports, a staff member had written, "Displays signs of emotional dependence. May pose a risk of misinterpretation by visitors." They didn't mean physical risk. They meant emotional risk. They meant he makes people feel something they don't know how to name. There was one story in the notes that stuck with Rachel. During his time at the previous sanctuary, a new intern had arrived, young, eager, cautious. She'd been warned not to interact too much with the animals, especially the big cats. But one evening after finishing her shift, she walked past Taro's enclosure and stopped. He was pressed against the fence, silent, watching her. She knelt. He didn't move. She reached a gloved hand toward the mesh, and Taro leaned his head into it. The report didn't say what happened next, only that the intern had cried and returned every day after that just to sit near him after hours. She left 3 months later, said she was going back to school to study animal psychology, but the final line of that entry read, "Interaction discouraged, too much attachment forming." It's strange, isn't it, that we ask animals not to feel, not to bond, that we ask people the same thing. Ben thought about that as he stood near Taro's run later that day. The bobcat was stretched in the patch of sun that slipped in through the western wall. His tail flicked gently. His eyes were half closed. When Ben approached, Taro didn't stand. He just turned his head, slowly blinked and exhaled. It wasn't a test. It was an invitation. Ben sat. No gloves, no fear, just quiet company. It reminded him of something his partner once said during a thunderstorm back when life was full of other kinds of noise. "You don't have to fix the storm. You just have to sit through it with me." Taro wasn't a storm, but he was a kind of weather, a creature carrying his own atmosphere of need, of memory, of hope. And he didn't want someone to tame it, just to sit through it. We don't often talk about how love can make people or animals unwanted, how longing itself can feel like a burden to those who aren't ready to receive it. But this is the truth beneath many stories of surrender. Not every animal is abandoned because it bites. Some are abandoned because they reach out, and reaching out again and again with no one reaching back can wear something down, even the wildest things. But Taro hadn't given up. He still reached, with his eyes, with his body, with his stillness. Rachel told Ben that she'd watched him one evening after everyone left. She'd stood quietly in the hallway, lights dimmed. Taro was alone in his enclosure, and he was hugging the blanket, not dragging it, not tearing it, just curling into it, one paw tucked around it the way a child might hug a stuffed animal. He did it slowly, deliberately, as if remembering how it felt to be held. She'd gone home that night and cried in the shower, not because she pitied him, but because he still had hope. Maybe that's what made Taro different. He hadn't been trained to love. He'd chosen to. Every day, even after being left behind, he chose again. And there's something sacred about that. In a society that praises independence and celebrates solitude, affection is sometimes seen as an inconvenience, something messy, excessive. But what if affection isn't excess? What if it's instinct? What if, in some creatures, in some people, the need to connect is as natural as breathing? There are things that make a bobcat unique. Their tufted ears, the white spots on the backs of them, the way their paws move almost silently through dry grass. But for Taro, his uniqueness wasn't anatomical. It was emotional. He wasn't too wild. He was too willing to trust, too willing to be close, too willing to offer something gentle. And that willingness cost him a place in places that didn't know how to hold it. Have you ever offered something gentle and been told it was too much? It would take a different kind of place and a different kind of person to see Taro not as a liability, but as a mirror. Someone who wasn't afraid of what Taro reflected back. Someone who needed it just as much. That someone was already walking the trail toward the shelter. And he didn't know it yet, but he was about to meet a bobcat who would change everything. Sometimes the right place doesn't feel like a rescue. It feels like being remembered, even if you've never been there before. On a Thursday morning in late April, a man named Micah walked up the long gravel path that wound through the cedar trees past the garden of native ferns and toward the front office of Cedar Valley Shelter. The sun was slow to rise that day, hung low in a sky the color of wet slate, and the air had that quiet weight you only find in the mountains. You could smell moss, distant rain, a hint of pine bark warming in the light. Micah had been walking for a while even before he reached the gate. He didn't know it yet, but this visit wasn't about volunteering or even curiosity. It was about resonance. There's a kind of stillness that lives in people who've endured too much noise. Micah had that stillness. He didn't talk much when he arrived, filled out the clipboard at the front desk with careful print, sat when offered coffee but never drank it. His hands were weathered, calloused in the way that suggests both labor and time. When asked what brought him in, he just said, "I moved nearby. Figured I should meet the neighbors." The receptionist smiled politely. She didn't ask for more. But Rachel, who had just finished checking Taro's enclosure, caught the moment his eyes lingering on a small framed photo on the counter, a bobcat with tired eyes pressed softly against a fence. She watched Micah exhale, slow and deliberate. Something in him recognized that stillness. Later that day, Rachel found him again. He'd wandered toward the back paddocks, where the harder-to-place animals lived, the ones not ready for the public, the ones too old or too wounded to be showcased, the ones with stories too quiet for spectacle. She walked with him a while, pointing out who was who, the blind hawk that refused to perch, the shy raccoon who'd made a habit of folding her kibble like laundry. And then finally, she stopped in front of a glass front enclosure tucked into the edge of the grove. "Taro," she said simply. "He's new here." Micah didn't ask anything right away, just stood there. Taro was lying near the back tail, curled over his paws, his eyes half-lidded, but watching, always watching. There was no big moment, no sudden gesture. Micah didn't press against the glass. He didn't kneel. He just stood, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly dropped. Taro lifted his head. Micah didn't move. After a moment, Taro stood slowly and walked toward the glass, stopped a foot away and leaned in, not forcefully, not for food. He pressed his shoulder, then the side of his head into the pane. Quiet, steady, willing. Micah let out a breath. Not heavy, just real, and whispered almost to himself, "That's not nothing." They stayed like that for a long time. Still, mutual, present, the kind of moment that doesn't make a sound but echoes for hours. Micah came back the next day, and the next. He didn't ask about adoption. He didn't ask about access. He brought a thermos of tea and a small folding chair, sat by the glass, sometimes read out loud from a notebook, sometimes just watched the birds beyond the trees. Taro never left the window when Micah was there. It became a kind of ritual, a friendship without noise, a companionship without expectation. We don't talk enough about how two quiet things can still find each other. How stillness doesn't mean absence, it means readiness. It means presence. For animals that have been misunderstood, misread, mislabeled, this kind of presence is rare. For people too. When Rachel asked Micah days later what drew him to the shelter, he paused a long time before answering. "I used to design churches," he said finally. "Structures, sacred spaces, places people could enter and breathe easier. But somewhere along the way, it started feeling hollow." He looked toward Taro's enclosure. "I think I forgot how to sit still with something that didn't expect anything from me. There was no application yet, no decision made, just time. And time, as it turns out, was what both Micah and Taro had been denied in so many other places. In the evenings, Micah stayed a little longer than he meant to. Once Rachel saw him fall asleep in the chair, his sketchbook half open on his lap. Taro had curled near the window, his breath fogging the glass in gentle rhythms. Rachel didn't wake him. Some healing happens when no one is watching. There's a word wildlife behaviorists sometimes use: affinitive behavior. It refers to animals who seek connection not for dominance, not for survival, but for something softer: companionship, safety. Taro's behavior wasn't conditioned, it was chosen. And Micah, in his stillness, responded the same way. Not everyone understands this kind of bond. Some shelter volunteers raised concerns. What if Micah gets too close? What if it complicates things? But Rachel, who'd seen love show up in forms most people miss, just shook her head. "They've both already been too far," she said. "What they're doing now is finding the middle. It's easy to label behavior when you don't sit long enough to understand it." But Micah sat. And so did Taro. And in that shared pause, a kind of language formed, wordless. But sure, it's worth noting here that Cedar Valley wasn't a large facility. It didn't have the funding or fame of bigger wildlife rescues. There were no big signs or guided tours, just hand-built enclosures tucked into trees' soft paths between them and volunteers who showed up when they could. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in space. Not physical space, emotional space. The kind of space where a bobcat could be quiet without being invisible, where a man could be grieving and not be rushed out of it, where healing didn't look dramatic, it looked like stillness held with care. Sometimes the most extraordinary bonds don't begin with grand gestures. They begin with the decision to return, and Micah did, day after day. Until one afternoon, Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "You know, if you're thinking about a more permanent arrangement, we could talk." Micah didn't answer right away. He just turned toward the enclosure where Taro had risen and was slowly, carefully pressing his paw to the glass. Then he looked back at Rachel, eyes damp not from sadness, but from knowing. "Yes," he said. "Let's talk." Most stories about rescue are about saving, but this one wasn't about who saved whom. It was about recognition. Two creatures both told they were too much, too quiet, too broken, finding each other in a place that asked for neither explanation nor proof, just presence. And that's where the healing begins. Have you ever been somewhere that didn't ask you to change, just asked you to stay? What followed wasn't easy. Taro still carried old instincts. Micah still carried old grief. But the rituals they built together, quiet meals, sketching near the window, long evenings with no sound but breath and birdsong, became something sacred. And soon the bobcat who hugged the world would learn what it meant to be held back. Some bonds aren't built in big moments. They're built in small ones, repeated with care, again and again, until the silence feels safe. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic turning point, no scene that would make it into a documentary reel, no music swelled, no crowd clapped, no one whispered, "This is it." But for Taro, the bobcat healing came slowly like sunlight spilling across an old wooden floor. Quiet, unhurried, and always the same time of day. It began with ritual. When Micah brought Taro home, the staff at Cedar Valley helped install a custom indoor-outdoor enclosure beside his modest cabin tucked between the trees. The space had been used once as a gardening shed, but now it smelled of cedar chips and soft hay. There were shaded shelves, a low platform by the window, and a tunnel that led to a covered outdoor run where Taro could feel the earth beneath his paws. Micah didn't rush the introductions. He opened the doors, set the blankets down, and waited. That first evening, Taro circled the space 3 times. Silent, careful. Micah said nothing. He just poured a cup of tea, sat in his chair near the window, and read aloud, though he wasn't sure why. Just a few lines from an old journal, words about wind and time and the feeling of being very small under a big sky. Taro didn't react. He just lay down near the bookshelf, not curled, not caged, just near. The next morning, Micah left a bowl of cut venison near the door and stepped outside. Watched as Taro approached, sniffed, and ate not quickly but with focus, like each piece held meaning. And when he was done, he turned not toward the tunnel or the enclosure, but toward Micah's boots. He didn't press against them, not yet. But he stood beside them, tail flicking once, then twice, before padding off to the far end of the yard to sit beneath the shade of a birch tree. That was the beginning. Rituals formed quietly the way moss creeps over stone. Each morning, Micah placed a warm towel by the window ledge. Taro would stretch long across it, paws, dangling eyes half-lidded, tracking the slow movement of clouds through the trees. Each evening, Micah would prepare the same meal, small portions of game meat herbs that echoed the wild water chilled with a single ice cube. Taro came to expect the rhythm not with impatience but with trust, because healing for creatures like him is often less about freedom and more about predictability. Micah began sketching again, not just buildings or landscapes, but moments. Taro curled on the rug, Taro blinking into the sunset, Taro watching a single leaf fall, his head tilting slightly as if the descent of one thing could tell him something about the whole world. There was a moment 2 weeks in that stayed with Micah. He had come in from town just a few errands, nothing long, but the sky had darkened faster than expected and thunder began to roll low across the valley. When he opened the door, he found Taro crouched in the corner of the enclosure, eyes wide, body trembling. Not wild-eyed, not frantic, just folded into himself. Micah didn't speak. He didn't rush. He sat on the floor near the edge of the rug and hummed. Nothing fancy, just a soft, steady rhythm that had once been a lullaby. He didn't know if Taro could even hear it. But slowly the shaking eased. And after a time, Taro rose, crossed the room, and placed his body full weight against Micah's leg. It wasn't a hug. It was something deeper, a choosing. Bobcats aren't known for this kind of closeness. They're solitary by nature, fiercely independent, built for silence and stillness, not affection. But Taro, like some rare exceptions in the wild, carried something different. A need not only to exist, but to coexist. Not to be held down, but to be held with. It's easy to see companionship as a human trait. To believe that animals, especially wild animals, don't seek connection in the same way. But spend enough time around them, and you start to understand companionship isn't a trick. It's a rhythm, a shared breath, a returned glance, the feeling of someone near without demand. And that was what Taro and Micah built. Each day brought the same rituals, and yet each one felt slightly different. Taro would move more freely. He'd stretch longer, let his eyes close deeper, let his weight rest heavier against Micah's side. One afternoon, Taro sat beside Micah's chair as he sipped tea and watched the fog rise from the hills. They were both quiet. Then, without fanfare, Taro let out a long, low purr. Not the high, fluttering kind of a kitten, but a deep earth-heavy rumble that seemed to come from somewhere ancient, like thunder through stone. Micah called it the earth hum, and from that day forward, he waited for it. It wasn't a performance. It was presence. We tend to think healing must look like change, that someone becomes stronger, or softer, or something else entirely. But sometimes healing just means returning to yourself with less fear. And that's what Micah saw in Taro. Not a transformation, but a restoration. A creature learning that he could trust his own instincts again. That softness wasn't a flaw. It was a language, and someone finally spoke it back. There's a phrase in psychology: co-regulation. It's what happens when one nervous system helps calm another. It's usually used to describe parents and infants. But maybe it applies to creatures like Micah and Taro too. Two beings, scarred and quiet, learning how to breathe in sync. Once a neighbor stopped by. She stood at the fence, eyes wide. "Aren't you scared?" she asked, watching Taro press his body against the screen door, waiting for Micah to return with a fresh towel. Of what Micah asked. He's a wildcat. They're unpredictable. Micah paused, then smiled softly. Most things with a heart are. The rituals continued. Warm towel at sunrise, tea and sketching at dusk. Soft radio music during storms. A hand placed near, not on Taro's back as he purred like a distant engine beneath the stars. They didn't change the world, but they changed a world. And sometimes that's more than enough. In a culture addicted to urgency, ritual can feel small, unimportant, dull. But rituals are how we remember we're alive, and how we teach each other to stay. Taro didn't need freedom, he needed rhythm, and in Micah's quiet presence, he found it. Do you have a ritual, small, gentle, that helps you feel safe in the world? The world didn't stop moving. Storms still came, noise still intruded, but something had shifted, and the more time passed, the more people began to ask, how can a bobcat love like this? Next, we explore the science and the mystery of why a creature built for solitude chose connection. You'd expect a wild animal to hiss, to hide, to fear the outstretched hand. But Taro leaned in. There were mornings when Micah would wake to the low hum of purring, not the delicate flutter of a kitten, but something heavier, deeper. It filled the room like the scent of earth after rain. That sound became part of his waking ritual. At first, Micah thought it must be unusual, this bobcat curled at the foot of his bed, pressed close to the old quilt, vibrating like a living heartbeat. But the more it happened, the more he wondered, why? Why did a creature made for solitude seek connection like this? Why did Taro, a wildcat, reach not for space, but for closeness? Micah wasn't one to rush into answers. But some questions feel too human to ignore. So one rainy afternoon, Micah wrote a letter. He sent it to a small wildlife research institute based out of Colorado, where specialists studied behavioral shifts in rescued carnivores. He included photos, brief notes, and a simple message: I'm not trying to turn him into a pet. I just want to understand who he already is. A week later, he got a call. Dr. Elaine Carter wasn't what he expected. Soft-spoken, older than her photo suggested. She listened more than she talked. They spoke for nearly an hour. Micah described the way Taro followed him from room to room, how he never begged, but always lingered, how he watched not to hunt, but as if waiting for something shared. Dr. Carter listened, then offered this: it's not about domestication. It's about imprinting. When a wild animal forms attachments early, especially during key developmental windows, it doesn't erase their instincts, but it reshapes their expectations. Taro's early years, as Micah had learned, were fractured. Taken as a cub, likely too young, and raised in a private home before bouncing between facilities. None of those places were equipped to raise a bobcat properly, not biologically, not emotionally. Somewhere along the line, Taro had learned that humans were not a threat, but a source of touch, of rhythm, of return. Micah asked if it was dangerous to allow this kind of bond. Dr. Carter paused. Affection in animals like bobcats is rare, but not unheard of. What's dangerous, she said, is when we misinterpret it, try to possess it, mold it, show it off. But if what you're offering is consistency, space, safety, and if what he's offering is trust, then it's not dangerous. It's a gift. That word settled into Micah's chest like warm tea. A gift, not a trick, not a performance, not a fluke, a choice. Taro, in his own language, was choosing connection, and Micah was learning to listen. Later that week, Rachel from the shelter dropped by to bring fresh materials for the enclosure. She watched as Taro padded toward Micah's chair, stretched alongside it, then without hesitation rested his head gently against Micah's foot. "He's still doing it, huh?" she said, half smiling. Micah nodded. Rachel crouched nearby, not too close, and added almost to herself, "Most wild animals learn to fear. It's how they survive." But Taro learned to hope instead. That's rarer than people think. The truth is, wild animal rescue is rarely about affection. It's about survival, medical care, nutrition, rehabilitation, release. But what happens when an animal doesn't just survive the wild, but survives the need for connection? Taro didn't fit the textbook. He wasn't meant to, and that's what made him matter. There's a behavioral term often used in zoology, affiliative response. It refers to actions that promote bonding, like grooming, nuzzling, or close physical proximity. You see it in wolves sharing food in elephants, wrapping trunks in big cats that sometimes rest cheek to cheek in captivity. In Taro's case, the response was subtle. A slow blink, a paw placed near, never on. The full weight of his body leaned gently, not to dominate, but to rest. Not all bobcats are like this. Most are reclusive, territorial. But Taro wasn't most bobcats, and perhaps Micah wasn't most people, because he never tried to explain Taro away. Never tried to use the affection for videos or visitors or online validation. He just kept showing up. Same cup of tea, same sketchbook, same quiet welcome, day after day. One afternoon, during a particularly heavy rain, Micah caught Taro standing at the window watching the water run down the glass. His ears twitched slightly at each rumble of thunder, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he looked at Micah, held the gaze, and then something small happened. Taro let out a low, breathy chuffing sound, almost like a sigh, almost like a hello. It wasn't the scream bobcats are famous for, the bone-deep cry that echoes through mountains and unsettles the dark. It was gentler, soft, a whisper of recognition. Micah chuffed back, and Taro blinked slowly, then lay down. It's a strange thing to witness affection where you were told there would only be distance, to feel warmth from something with claws and teeth, to realize that some forms of connection have nothing to do with language. They exist in the space between caution and curiosity, and if you're lucky, they choose you. Maybe real love isn't about ownership or control. Maybe it's about shared safety. Maybe in this world of fences and fears, affection is the most radical act of all, especially when it comes from those who were never supposed to give it. Especially when it's gentle. Has an animal ever trusted you before you trusted yourself? Tell us in the comments. Someone here will understand. Taro's trust didn't come with expectations. It came with presence. But one day, after weeks of soft ritual and stillness, he did something new. Something no one had seen since his first rescue. He hugged, not out of fear, not for food, but simply because he could. It didn't look like a movie moment. There was no music, no cheering, just the weight of one wild body leaning into another. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The sky was overcast, but not heavy. Birds were quieter than usual. Micah had woken early, made tea, and opened the side door to let the scent of damp cedar and distant lilac drift through the house. Taro had already begun his usual route. First, the window ledge, then the indoor rug, then a slow prowl through the outdoor tunnel, where dew glistened like scattered glass on the tall grass. There was nothing different, and yet everything was. Micah was sitting cross-legged on the wooden porch, a pencil resting between his fingers, his sketchbook open but mostly blank. His boots were off. The warmth of the teacup in his hands hadn't fully reached his chest. He was thinking about nothing in particular, or maybe about everything at once. Taro emerged from the tunnel, slowly, eyes steady, tail flicking once. He crossed the yard without hesitation. Quiet paw steps against stone and mulch. And then, without a pause or warning, he pressed his full-body shoulder ribs flank into Micah's back. Micah froze. The moment was so unexpected, so physical, so complete, that for a second he forgot to breathe. Taro didn't demand a response. He just leaned, not pawing, not pushing, just resting. His fur was warm, his breath even. One paw gently placed against the ground beside Micah's knee, a wildcat's version of a hug. Micah closed his eyes and let the weight settle. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stayed there, anchored by the quiet pressure of a creature who for once didn't want to escape or chase or defend. He just wanted to be. For the first time in years, Micah let tears rise without brushing them away. Not from sadness, but from the sheer tenderness of it. That someone, something who had been abandoned for loving too much, was now offering that love again with no hesitation, no fear, no performance, just presence. Later, when Micah described it to Rachel, he didn't use words like breakthrough or bond. He just said, he leaned into me, all the way in, like he was trusting gravity again. In wildlife rescue, especially for big cats, trainers talk about body language. Ears, eyes, tail flicks, how to read when something's about to go wrong. But no manual teaches you how to respond when a bobcat initiates affection on his terms in his time. There was no protocol for this moment, because it wasn't part of a program, it was part of a relationship. It's easy to say that animals don't feel the way we do, but those who've lived with animals, especially the misunderstood ones, the abandoned ones, know better. They know the difference between reaction and choice, between instinct and intention. What Taro did that morning was not reflex. It was a decision. To risk nearness. To rest his body, his story, his fear, his softness against another. And that's no small thing. For the next few days, the ritual shifted. Taro didn't just stay near Micah. He began to seek out contact. A slow rub against the leg, a low purr when Micah hummed an old tune, a paw placed carefully on the edge of the chair, just enough to say, "I'm here if you are." It wasn't needy, it was generous. And when Micah reciprocated, placing a hand gently on Taro's back or resting his own head near the window where Taro slept, it felt mutual, balanced, earned. Some would say that affection like this from a wild animal is dangerous, that trust can blur the lines of what's safe. And yes, caution matters. But here's something else that matters: respect. Micah never overstepped. He didn't cuddle Taro like a house cat. He didn't parade him for visitors. He didn't push for more. He simply received what was given, and in doing so, gave something back. Affection, especially in animals that carry wildness in their bones, is not a guarantee. It's not something you teach or tame. It's something that's offered, carefully, slowly, and only when the one offering it feels it will be understood. Taro's hug that morning wasn't just a sign of healing. It was a mirror, a quiet reminder of how we all long to be close to something we trust, of how soft we can become once we stop being afraid. Micah told Rachel something else that week. He said, "You know, when my brother died, I didn't cry for months. Not because I didn't want to, but because no one around me could sit with the weight of it. It was always, 'Let's talk about something else,' or 'He's in a better place.'" He looked toward the enclosure where Taro was stretched out in a beam of light, paws twitching as if chasing something gentle in a dream. But when Taro leans on me, I don't have to say anything. I don't have to explain why my chest hurts. He just stays. And sometimes, that's all we need. Not solutions, not speeches, just someone to stay. In a culture that often rushes through pain, Taro's hug was a pause. A moment that said, "It's okay to be soft here." And isn't that what most of us are looking for? Not answers, not applause, just permission to be held for exactly who we are, where we are. Have you ever felt seen by an animal in a way no person could manage? Share it below. There's space for your story here. Word of Taro's story. This hugging bobcat, this wild heart that trusted again, began to spread beyond the trees and fences of Cedar Valley. Letters came. Visitors stopped by the gates just to glimpse the enclosure. But one face familiar and worn would arrive without warning. And in her hands, she carried a memory older than anyone expected. Times the past doesn't knock. It just shows up, carrying the same scent, the same softness, and a goodbye that took years to find its way back. It was just after noon when Rachel heard the bell above the shelter's gate ring softly. She'd been trimming herbs in the quiet garden behind the office lavender, mostly for calming the raccoons, and didn't think much of it at first. Visitors came now and then. A few curious hikers, some donors, the occasional local family, looking for a volunteer shift. But when she rounded the front path and saw the woman standing just outside the entrance, something in her paused. There was a stillness in this visitor, a kind of careful standing, like someone who wasn't sure if they were allowed to be remembered. She wore a faded blue jacket, clean but well-loved, and held a worn manila folder tucked against her chest like it might slip away if she let go. Rachel stepped forward slow. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. The woman nodded. "I think I knew him," she said, "a long time ago." Her name was Gloria. She had been a volunteer at one of the wildlife centers where Taro had stayed years ago, back when he was still learning how to be a bobcat in a world that didn't quite know what to do with one like him. She had fed him, cleaned his enclosure, sat beside him during storms when he pressed his body against the chain link like it might open a door. She'd been there the day he was transferred unexpectedly. A funding issue, a change in management, the kind of abrupt decision that happens in places stretched thin on time and thinner on money. She hadn't been allowed to say goodbye. In the years that followed, Gloria had kept pieces of Taro's story. A photograph tucked into a kitchen drawer. A short video clip she'd once taken on a flip phone, him rubbing his cheek against a flannel shirt draped over a stool. Her handwritten notes dated detailed, tender. "I knew he wouldn't remember me," she said, voice steady but low. "I just needed to see him okay." Rachel understood. Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet paperwork. Sometimes it's watching the same animal documentary on loop. Sometimes it's showing up when the road has already ended just to place your hand on the gate. Micah wasn't home when Gloria arrived, but Rachel called him. He was out on the edge of the woods sketching birds, said he'd be back in an hour. So Rachel walked Gloria slowly down the path toward Taro's enclosure. She didn't explain, didn't narrate, just opened the gate. Let the woman stand where the gravel turned to bark chips just feet from where the bobcat lay stretched across the indoor platform, drowsing in the late sun. Taro didn't move at first. He opened his eyes lazily the way someone does when the light changes in a room. Blinked once, then again, and then he stood slow, cautious. He moved toward the window pane that separated his run from the viewing space, ears twitching, head tilted slightly, not with confusion, but with the kind of curiosity that comes from recognizing something just outside your memory. Gloria didn't speak. She took a single step forward. Taro pressed his nose to the glass. And then, after several still-held seconds, he brushed the side of his face along it. Slowly, deliberately, a movement so familiar it nearly took a breath. She let out a small, soundless laugh. "He used to do that," she whispered, "whenever I wore lavender lotion." Rachel watched silently. There are moments in this work that you never forget. This was one of them, not because it was flashy or dramatic, but because it felt like a door closing, gently, properly. A goodbye that had been waiting for its right shape. When Micah arrived, he found them seated side by side on the bench near the enclosure. Gloria looked up. "You're the one he hugs." Micah chuckled softly. "Sometimes, if I'm lucky." They talked for a while about Taro's quirks, his sleep habits, his favorite spot in the yard where the sun hits just right. Gloria listened like someone memorizing a lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood. And then, as the shadows began to stretch across the dirt path, she stood. "I should go," she said, placing the folder gently in Rachel's hands. "I didn't come to stay, just to see." Before she left, she stepped close to the fence one last time. Taro had returned to the platform, but he sat up again when she approached. She raised her hand just slightly and said quietly, "Thank you for remembering." Taro blinked, the slow, sure blink of recognition, and then lay back down, his body loose, his breath easy. Safe. Later that night, Rachel opened the folder. Inside were printed notes, photos, even a small drawing done in charcoal Taro as a younger cub curled beside a towel looking not unlike he did now. There was a line at the bottom of one page scribbled in Gloria's handwriting. "Some animals don't ask for anything except a place to stay soft." Rachel left the folder on the table in Micah's studio. Didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted. Micah noticed Taro lingering near the window longer at dusk, looking out toward the path, not expectant, just still, as if holding space for something he couldn't name. That week, a letter came in from a viewer of the shelter's update blog. A woman named Delia, who lived in Minnesota, had been following Taro's story since the first post went viral. She wrote, "I'm 61, widowed. My kids are grown and scattered, but I check the shelter's site every morning. I watch your bobcat like he's family. He reminds me that there's still something good in the world that doesn't expect anything from me except presence. And I can give that, even from here." Taro's story had become more than a story. It had become a place, a soft corner of the world where being too loving wasn't a problem to be fixed, but a gift to be witnessed. Most rescues end with a home, a new beginning. But some rescues end with understanding, with someone human or animal finally being seen in their full softness without it needing to be tamed. Gloria didn't come to reclaim the past. She came to honor it. And in doing so, she gave Taro and herself what they were both once denied, a proper goodbye. Have you ever said goodbye years after it was needed? Your story matters here. Leave it below for someone else to carry with you. The seasons began to shift. Taro's coat thickened. His steps grew slower, more deliberate. But something in him remained unchanged, the way he reached out softly daily, without fear. And Micah, in his own quiet grief, reached back. Not to fix, not to hold, but to stay. Some stories end in closure, but Taro's didn't end. It simply softened. By the time autumn arrived, the trees around the cabin had turned gold in rust. Leaves drifted like slow dancers through the still air, blanketing the walking path that circled the enclosure. The river nearby ran quieter now, low and steady. And in the mornings, mist hung low over the field, like a memory that hadn't decided whether to stay or pass through. Taro moved slower these days. His steps, once light and curious, had become more deliberate. The fur along his shoulders had silvered a little just at the edges, and his favorite napping spot on the window shelf stayed warm well into the afternoon sun. Micah had noticed it gradually, a longer pause before rising, more time spent watching the trees rather than exploring them. He didn't worry, he just adjusted. Let things take their time. Sometimes that's the most loving thing we can do. There were no big changes, no dramatic vet visits, no stormy setbacks. Just time doing what time does. But what never changed, what never even paused, was Taro's affection. He still met Micah at the doorway every morning, still placed his paw near the chair leg when it was time for tea, still rested the weight of his body beside Micah's when the evenings cooled and silence stretched out wide. One night, as rain tapped lightly on the roof, Micah sat by the fire with his sketchbook. Taro was sprawled across the rug, belly exposed, one paw twitching in his sleep. Micah flipped through the pages. Taro in summer, chasing a falling leaf. Taro watching a butterfly through the screen. Taro mid-hug, wrapped around his leg like a wild shadow, learning to stay still. Micah smiled, then paused, then let the tears come. Not from pain, but from the quiet realization that for the first time in years he felt full. Not busy, not distracted, not chasing anything, just full. Because in a world that asks us to be efficient, productive, unbothered, Taro had shown him that love, gentle, repetitive, unashamed, was enough. More than enough. We live in a time that often labels softness as weakness. People who care too much are called sensitive. Animals that seek connection are labeled needy. Wild creatures who love, who bond, who wait by fences just to be near you, are told they're not safe to keep. But what if it's the world that needs to change its definition of safety? What if safety isn't about walls or distance or silence? What if safety is found in companionship, in letting something wild trust you? And trusting it back. Taro was never meant to be a spectacle. He was never meant to be a house pet. He was never supposed to purr or lean or wrap his paws around a human's leg like a baby bobcat who never quite unlearned his first memory of warmth. But he did, because love, even in wild places, finds a way. There's a photo Micah keeps by the front door now. Taro curled beside the fire, one paw draped gently across Micah's worn boot. You can't see either of their faces, just the weight, the closeness, the choice. Visitors stop, sometimes look at it and ask, "Is that a dog?" No, Micah says. He's a bobcat, but mostly he's family. The truth is, most wild animal rescue stories don't end with hugs. They end with releases into forests, with goodbyes at fences, with paw prints fading into tall grass. And that's the right thing most of the time. But sometimes, rarely, a wild animal doesn't return to the wild. Not because they can't, but because they've formed something different. A kind of bond that sits in between. Not ownership, not dependence, just companionship, like Taro, who was once abandoned for being too affectionate, but now is home. Cedar Valley Shelter still gets letters, sometimes from children who learned about Taro in class, sometimes from retired teachers, nurses, farmers, people who've known what it means to feel too much in a world that prefers quiet discomfort over expressed connection. One woman wrote, "I lost my husband 5 years ago. I haven't hugged anyone in months." But when I watch Taro lean into Micah, something in me breathes again. We tend to think animal rescue is about saving animals. But sometimes animals save us. They teach us how to slow down, how to listen without fixing, how to sit beside something without changing it. Taro never asked to be healed. He just kept showing up, offering presence, offering softness. And in doing so, he reminded the people around him what it feels like to be chosen not for being useful or perfect or impressive, but simply for being there. In the end, Taro didn't become less wild. He became more whole, because love doesn't tame us. It roots us. It makes us feel safe enough to stretch out in the sun and close our eyes, even if we once learned that safety could disappear in a blink. Too much love is never really the problem. It's the world's inability to receive it fully that hurts. But when love lands, when it's met, mirrored, welcomed, something shifts. Not loudly, not quickly, but forever. So if you've ever been told you're too soft, too open, too affectionate, if you've ever felt like your presence was too much for someone else's comfort, maybe you're not the problem. Maybe you're just like Taro, a reminder that affection isn't weakness, it's survival, and it's beautiful. Take a moment right now to think about who or what in your life makes you feel safe enough to be your softest self. Maybe it's a pet, maybe it's a person, maybe it's a place. If you'd like to carry Taro's story with you, share a comment below. Tell us where you find your safety, your softness, your place to rest. And if this story gave you something to hold on to, gentleness, hope, even just a breath, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps us share more heartwarming stories like this one, and it lets us keep creating a quiet place on the internet that feels like a soft porch in the woods. And if you'd like to go one step further, we'd be honored to have your support. A super thanks, or even a small donation, helps shelters like Cedar Valley continue to rescue and rehabilitate wild animals like Taro creatures with big paws, wild hearts, and more love than the world expected. Because sometimes what saves us has whiskers.